Do we have any feedback from last week's episode?
We don't. We're swiftly on.
Let's move on from that then. In the spirit of follow-up, I have ordered an office seat.
Very exciting. Which one did you go for?
The deed is done, Dani. The deed is done. The decision has been made. I actually went for the Capisco Pulse in the end.
I'm kind of not at all surprised. I thought, from our conversation last time, I pretty much gathered that was likely to be the one you were going to go for.
Actually, it was our conversation last time that solidified it in my mind as being the right direction. Just when we were talking about what makes Aeron chairs, and by extension, the Setu chair from Herman Miller that we mentioned, what makes them so comfortable is that you're kind of reclining back, kind of like a deck chair. So that's great, but it also means that leaning forward, which I do a lot of, either to play an instrument or to eventually, once everything arrives, to tweak synthesizers and play stuff on a MIDI keyboard, you kind of really are pulling yourself up, and it's not that comfortable position to be in. And the Capisco Pulse, on the other hand, is actually made for that position where you are kind of upright and makes you much more mobile. So I went for the white version with the black seat pad and black legs, which is actually
a good choice. That is the one that I was going to get had I got it, and probably the one that I will still get if I do get one eventually.
Unfortunately, I have to wait 2 weeks for it now, despite having ordered it last week. Yet they don't actually keep any stock here in Stockholm.
Oh, it's a bit disappointing, isn't it? You'd hope. If they had anything there, they'd have stock.
So they're having to order it in. So it's going to be fresh, unspoiled. It's going to be a virgin chair, ready to have my have my weight placed on it for extended periods of time. And to be honest, Dani, I mentioned this to you after I'd actually made the purchase. I'm a little bit nervous, if I'm honest. I think this is the right choice. Well, in fact, after our conversation, I'm sure this is the right choice, but because it's just such an unconventional chair, and I'm sure we've all had that kind of bad experience with unconventional chairs where, you remember in the 90s, there used to be those funky chairs that you kind of kneel on?
Yeah, but I don't think I ever really used them enough. Because in the 90s, I was still in school. So.
Yeah, my homework desk chair was one of those funky chairs that you actually kneel on.
Oh, really?
It was horrible. It just doesn't work. I'm sure it works for some people, but you just get so tired sitting on them, and it just doesn't feel like a natural position to be in. So this Capisco Pulse, I didn't actually know. Actually, the Capisco chair it's a design from the 80s, I think. So it's got about 30 years of...
oh, right. Yeah, I thought it was a relatively recent thing.
It isn't. Actually, it's got, many decades of pedigree behind it. And it was popular enough for them to make a second version of it, which is the Pulse. So, I guess something about it is good, and it comes highly recommended by people who have one. So... Yeah,
I'm sure it'll be great for doing work on, great for... tweaking synthesizer knobs. I'll be very interested to hear how you find it for playing instruments on, playing your bass on. I do find that my office chair, which is wrong in all sorts of ways, is not at all designed for playing guitar, not the least of which it has arms, although they are quite flexible, so I can move them out of the way. But I find that it's not that pleasant to play guitar on, and I more often than not actually get my piano stool out when I want to play guitar, just because that is a more sort of neutral, easier chair to play on. So I'll be interested to hear how the sort of, because it's quite high, the Capisco Pulse. You'll be balanced a bit higher.
Yeah.
But it does leave your legs very free. So, it could go either way. I'll be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I actually got the low version.
Okay.
Because the table that I have doesn't go up that high. So I got the lower version. But I'll put the table up as high as it can go because it has slightly adjustable legs, and I'll be sitting a little bit higher than normal, which seemed to be sort of a comfortable point for Capisco, where it's just a little bit higher than normal. The main criteria, I think, for a guitar chair is basically that, A, you have nothing on left and right side to interfere with the body of the instrument, and B, if you're resting the instrument on your leg, then having something to prop up your leg on to keep that thigh up so that it doesn't fall off,
right,
is useful too. And the Capisco has those really cool foot plates on the wheelbase. I actually tend to play when I'm sitting down playing bass. I actually do it the Gary Willis. Gary Willis is a really great jazz fusion, progressive jazz bass player who plays for a fantastic band called Tribal Tech. And he always promotes a sitting style with the bass guitar where you basically have it strapped on you, and instead of having it resting on your leg, you actually put it right in front of you. So essentially, it's exactly the same position as when you're standing up. So the instrument actually falls in between your legs when you're sitting down. Okay,
that's much as you would play a classical guitar.
It's exactly the same way you play a classical guitar, except not angled up so high, because I think you often see classical guitarists with the neck angled up very high. But this Gary Willis style, basically his point behind it is that you want to match exactly this, as close as you can, the position that you have it when you're standing.
Right.
So that you don't have any changes of wrist angle or changes of elbow angle or how much your upper arm is sticking out from your body, especially your right upper arm if you're a right-handed player. Keeping that completely consistent with what it is when you're standing up is it just saves you from having to deal with positional differences, kind of like perfecting a golf swing, you know?
Right, yeah.
You want to make it exactly the same every time, and that way you can focus on the important things like distance and aim and things like that. So that's the way I tend to play when I'm sitting down, and for that the Capisco is absolutely perfect because your legs don't stick up; they're slightly off on the down angle. So anyway, enough about chairs. We'll see. I'll keep you posted.
Great, yeah. Well, speaking of guitars and all that segues nicely into my blog post that I put up over the weekend. A rare event indeed.
I was extremely impressed by that blog post. You're going to have to tell everybody about it.
So I do have a blog, and it's mostly a programming blog, but I decided to put something a little bit different over the weekend because it was Labor Day weekend this past weekend, so we had Monday off. So I had a bit of extra time. And I've been on a bit of a Cradle of Filth binge recently. Cradle of Filth are a very famous British black metal band who I was a big fan of in my youth and remain a fan of now, to be honest. But I've been listening to a lot of their stuff recently, and they've got a new album coming out this month, so I'm kind of building up to that. But they have a song called Nymphetamine Fix, which is from their album Nymphetamine, which was released in, I think, 2006, somewhere around that. And it's actually the album that got me back into Cradle of Filth, because I used to like them a lot when I was around 16, 17. And then they released this just absolutely appalling EP called Bittersweets to Succubi. And it was terrible. They're one of the only bands that I've heard that have done covers of their own earlier songs and done them badly. Like, really murdered their own earlier work. And so for a while I just stopped buying their albums because I thought, they're crap now. But then I was living when I moved to Newcastle and I was working there, I was sharing a flat with a few other people, one of whom listened to Cradle of Filth, and she had a couple of their more recent albums, including this one. And she lent them to me, and I realized, they're actually, they're quite good. They only released, one or two bad records, and then they got back into making pretty good ones. So I should give them another go. And this Nymphetamine Fix it's a good song. It's quite mainstream, I think, which if you've never heard Cradle of Filth and you listen to it, you will find an odd thing to say. But if you've heard a lot of their stuff, I think this definitely is a bit more kind of mainstream rocky sort of side.
Right.
But it's got a good hook. It gets stuck in your head, and you keep sort of humming it to yourself. And so I'd been listening to the song, I had it stuck in my head, and I sort of was fiddling about on the guitar just I use my guitar more or less as a kind of desk fiddle toy now. I don't actually play it all that seriously anymore. And so I was just fiddling around with it and ended up playing the kind of main melody that you hear a lot in this song. And I thought, that'd be quite cool to play. Like, this is a classical. The only guitar I've brought with me first to Japan and then with me to America is my classical guitar.
Right.
I left my electric guitar and steel string back at my parents' house. So this is all I've got. So I've not really played any sort of rock or metal or anything like that in years because I don't have an electric guitar or an amp or anything.
Right.
So I make do. And I thought, well, it'd be quite cool to have a fingerstyle arrangement of this Cradle of Filth song that you could play on classical guitar. But I'm not that great at playing by ear. So I had to look up I looked up the tabs for the song that somebody had, transcribed the song as it was originally meant to be, with all power chords and distorted guitar and all that.
Right.
And I looked up somebody else had done a piano arrangement, and she's put this arrangement up on YouTube. I'll put the link in the show notes because it's very good, quite difficult, and she makes a couple of mistakes during the performance, but it's very impressive still. And I think she does quite a lot of covers of interesting sort of metal songs and things like that on piano, so it's interesting to look at. Anyway, the sheet music for that was up on the internet somewhere, so I came across that. And from these two things, while I was looking at those, I started transcribing this arrangement that could be played on guitar and fingerstyle, and decided to put it up on my website. And I started off doing it by like reading them and figuring out how to play it and kind of playing it and then writing that down. But then partway through, my wife was watching TV, and so I couldn't play guitar anymore without disturbing her. But I wanted to carry on. And that's when I realized that the tool that I was using to write this notation, which is a tool called Lilypond, it supports exporting to MIDI.
Right.
And so from that point on, I was writing this arrangement and trying to write it with a view to being physically playable on the guitar. But I wasn't actually playing it as I wrote it. I was just exporting it to MIDI and then listening to it in headphones so I could kind of hear what it sounded like.
Wow.
So from that point on, there is a chance that I've written something that, is actually physically impossible to play, because I haven't confirmed it by playing it on my guitar. But I'm pretty sure that if you're very good, it's all possible. I would need some practice to be able to play this arrangement that I myself have written.
Right.
And so I'm trying to go through and sort of practice that now. And it is quite difficult, and it might be worth sort of taking some notes out and trying to make an easier to play version of it. But I'm pretty sure that, if with a lot of practice, I think I could play it, and somebody who's better than me could perhaps play it with less practice. And it sounds great. Like if you listen to did you listen to the MIDI? I put a render of that MIDI file up on the post.
No, I just looked at your transcript in Lilypond, and I was very impressed.
Yeah, Lilypond makes some nice looking sheet music.
Yeah.
And so it also supports outputting it as in traditional notation or using guitar tablature or both.
Which is fantastic.
So I had all of those as options. The tablature is quite interesting because obviously on a guitar there are a number of ways of playing each note. And the default in Lilypond is that you write in the note names.
Right.
And it just tries to guess at what would be the most convenient way to play it. So it does all the tablature for you automatically. And for the most part, it gets it right. Like it does a pretty good job of seeing what notes are being played closely together and trying to find where on the guitar would be the best way to play those, to make them easier to play, one after another. There were a couple of places where it just did some really silly things. And I had to go in and add annotations to say, you should play this note on the 5th string, not the 4th string,
right,
or whatever. And I think there might be one or two places that still need that I haven't spotted, which I'll find as I go through it now and start trying to play it and realize, oh, this would be much better if you just played the same note, a bit further up the fretboard on the next string. So, yeah, there might be a little bit of work left to do, but it was a fun little weekend project. And I think if I can get to play it as well as the computer plays it, then it will sound pretty good, because the MIDI file sounds all right, if I say so myself.
Now, Dani, I'm going to ask for your help with something here at this point.
What's that?
Let's talk musicology for a while. Now, I love all music, and I'm always curious to hear from people who really like a specific style of music that I don't generally understand so thoroughly.
Right.
Exactly what it is about that style of music that they like. So, when it comes to death metal, you would not be the first person of for people who know Dani is a very gentle, intellectual, mild-mannered, very polite person. Basically, what you hear on Station 13 is what you get with our Daniel. But you wouldn't be the first intellectual, mild-mannered, gentle, softly spoken person that I've met who really, really likes death metal. And this is, it's not really the kind of music that, at least the image of this kind of person you would associate with music that sounds very aggressive and very dark and very, well, I mean, let's face it, quite violent from a musical point of view. So I'm really curious to know, A, what is it that you like about death metal? And B, what is the criteria for you when you listen to a variety of death metal and you say, I don't really like that one, but I like this one? Like, what is both of these questions can probably be answered with the same answer, but what is it about the death metal that you like? What criteria does it need in order for you to say, yes, this is good death metal that I like?
Right. Well, yeah, it's interesting because most of the people that I've met who are into death metal and black metal and like aggressive metal genres like that are quite soft-spoken, relaxed people. Even if, to look at them, they look quite imposing sometimes. If when I was younger, used to do all the corpse paint and the long black leather trench coat and all of that. And many people, still do. I know people who are into metal who still only wear black,
right,
and don't wear any other color than black, which was the case for me for a couple of years. But eventually I decided to branch out
into navy.
I started with brown.
Oh, okay, brown. That's
eventually reached for red.
YOLO.
And it was
YOLO.
Blue took a very long time. Now I wear quite a lot of blue, but I always actually quite disliked blue.
Okay.
And it was only it was my wife who got me into wearing blue clothes because she just kept buying me clothes and they were blue.
Right.
So, sometimes I think if you don't speak to someone who is into this music and they are like visually, obviously they look like a goth, that can also it can be quite an aggressive look, especially if they go for the sort of all the big piercings and the big metal jewelry and the claws and things like that.
Yeah.
But most of the people that I've met, when you speak to them, they're actually, soft-spoken, relaxed people. What you can draw from that, I don't really know. And maybe that says more about me and the people I hang out with than it says about metal in general.
No, I don't. I've come across exactly the same experience as you because I've played in one progressive metal band. I played bass, obviously, as I've mentioned. And progressive metal, meaning it's very, very technical. It's less important how you look and more important how, blazing fast you play, or, how basically, the bass having to track the guitar all over all those incredible runs playing in unison.
Right.
Rather than having your guitar strapped down somewhere on your thighs, like i.e. extremely low.
Right, you have it very, very high, so you've got the control, yeah.
That's right, you have it sort of basically right up on your chest and up like that to maintain maximum efficiency and maximum playability. And the guys that I played with, this was in Australia in this band, and the guys that I played with were the kindest, most gentle, softly spoken, polite, just sweet characters, despite what they look like. I can remember the one guy, the guitarist in the band, his name was Michael, if I recall correctly, and we were talking about music that he listens to when he's not listening to metal, and he was saying he kind of talks in a high falsetto like this, and he said, yeah, well, I kind of like Clannad and Enya and ambient music I listen to a lot, and it's like it's almost, it seems like you get so much aggression, musical aggression comes out of you through this music that there's like no aggression left for the rest of your life, so you just remain this extremely peaceful, very quiet, calm kind of person. Is there something in that? Is there something about the fact that so much of it is so aggressive that what's left after the musical experience is basically, the character minus the aggression?
I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I go through phases. I'll sometimes, like at the moment, I'm going through a real metal phase. I'm listening to a lot of Cradle of Filth. I'm also listening to a lot of Turisas and Amon Amarth and a lot of sort of folk metal and things like that, which we'll touch on as well. But, sometimes I'll go for months and months and not listen to any metal at all and mostly listen to jazz and classical music. Or, sometimes I'll just listen to Tom Waits for for weeks on end. So, and I don't feel any more aggressive when I'm listening to less aggressive music. So I'm not sure there's a correlation there. But
Okay.
I mean, metal is a very broad category.
Right.
Even, you said death metal earlier, and Cradle of Filth, I think, would class themselves as melodic black metal.
Okay, well...
Which is a subcategory of black metal, which is a sort of sibling category of death metal.
Okay,
so
hold on a minute. Before we dive into all the genres, because that is a long discussion.
Right.
I would like to know, firstly, your favorite kind of metal. What is the appeal? Like, what is the criteria for you to listen to a song of your favorite genre of metal and think, this is great?
There's a couple of things. I quite like big sort of epic sounding things. And I quite like, there's quite a lot of metal, and a lot of metal people hate this. So this is sort of semi-controversial thing to say, but there's quite a lot of metal around now, including, I think, Cradle of Filth, and also the bands I mentioned earlier, Tyrisas and Amon Amarth, who you could class one of their influences. They're obviously influenced by Bathory and bands like that really were the birth of black metal in the 80s. But another one of their influences, I would say, is movie soundtracks. Like Hans Zimmer you could legitimately say, is an influence of a band like Tyrisas, I think.
I see.
Where they have these big sort of soundscapes in the background, and they take these kind of epic orchestral like phrases and use them and mix it in with this very aggressive metal music. And I happen to like that style of metal. I couldn't say why exactly. I mean, I quite like movie soundtracks as well. I like that, and I also quite like the feeling that they're telling a story, which you quite often get with these kind of very genre metal bands.
Right.
Like Tyrisas are a Viking metal band. A lot of their albums are telling a story about a particular group of Vikings. Amon Amarth, I mean, I don't know if you recognize the name. Amon Amarth are named after one of the towers in Minas Tirith or something.
Right.
It's the Amon Amarth, I think, is the name of the second tower or something of the Two Towers fame or something like that. It's a Lord of the Rings reference at any rate.
Was it Orthanc was one of them, and Amon Amarth is that the other one? Or am I thinking of something?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I might be getting it.
No,
I can't remember exactly which one it is, but they are exceptionally nerdy. Right?
Where's my copy of the Silmarillion? I've got to go read it again now.
And they are a Scandinavian band, I think. I can't remember exactly where they're from. And they play, again, similar sort of stories, Viking-based stories as well, but also sort of things that are based on fantasy settings and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that.
Right.
Cradle of Filth is less fantasy and more sort of your traditional gothic horror. So they did an album, the first album that I ever listened to by Cradle of Filth, which was the one that came out in 1998, around the time that I got into them, was Cruelty and the Beast, which is about Elizabeth Bathory, who is a real-life countess that lived in, I can't remember, Romania maybe, somewhere like that. And she was, in real life, I think she was just your typically cruel noblewoman. But because she was so cruel, these sort of stories grew up around her that like she bathed in human blood and things like that.
Right.
And that she kept her youth by bathing in the blood of virgins or something like that. And so this whole sort of mythology built up around her, similar to, Dracula. I think there was an actual Count Dracula once upon a time, but he wasn't a literal vampire. And so this album is kind of based on her mythology. And so much like Bram Stoker's Dracula is based on the mythical figure of Count Dracula the vampire, this album is also based on this kind of mythologized version of the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. And it's not, obviously she wasn't very nice and in real life. And like, I'm sure people did suffer under her when she was Countess. So that's not great. But they're not actually glorifying the real Elizabeth Bathory who lived and saying it's great to treat your servants terribly.
Right.
You know, but they're building up a kind of Gothic horror story out of this mythology.
Okay, so I want to get a closer musicological kind of picture of this style of music, though. So what we've known, or what we've learnt, is that you like that big cinematic, epic sort of grandeur, where it feels like the musical equivalent of just a big cathedral, large scale, very grand.
Right.
So that's one thing.
Yes, I like that, and I also quite like it doesn't compare with the sort of technical progressive metal that you were talking about, but I think there is a complexity to this sort of metal,
right,
that is rare in more popular music. I like popular music as well, but
right.
I do like the complexity and the amount of layering that you tend to get in black metal music and related genres.
Right, so it's kind of the opposite of minimalism. It's maximalism. What's the appeal of the technical side of it? Because metal has a whole range of different, really technical subgenres, and one of them, of course, is progressive metal. There's also neoclassical metal,
right,
which is exactly as the name describes.
Math metal is another one I've heard.
Math metal, that's a new one to me.
They play a lot with time signatures.
Okay. That kind of crosses over a little bit with one of my favorite genres, which is jazz fusion. But then what's I've always associated jazz fusion as being basically musicians' music. You know, when you listen to it, it's a kind of entertainment just to listen and follow the crazy things that they do.
Right.
And it's kind of, look at, you know, oh, you thought we're going to go there? No, we're not going to go there. We're going to go here. You know, come with us. And it's sort of this crazy adventure, like a musical adventure through all this weirdness, which is kind of what really progressive jazz fusion does really well. So it's kind of an entertainment form for musicians in that, you know, they play with your expectations as you listen to it. So when I hear from people who don't play musical instruments, who are purely consumers of music and avid consumers of music, and those people who say that they do like highly technical forms of music, I'm always curious to know what the appeal is if if there's no aspect of, wow, that guitarist is really good, or that bass player, listen to how fast he's playing. And if that's completely out of the equation, so there's no sense of being impressed by a person's musicianship.
Well, I think that's I think that's a false assumption. You can be impressed by a person's musicianship even if you yourself are not a musician.
I guess that's true, but I don't know that. Okay, well, winding it back then. So what's the appeal then to the technical side for you?
Well, okay. Firstly, I think what you're talking about with jazz fusion and appreciating the technical aspects and also the unpredictability of what's going to happen next is somewhat true for things like progressive metal and math metal. I don't think it's quite true for melodic black metal and folk metal and things like that. Folk metal in particular draws from traditional folk music, and as a result tends to be quite predictable because folk music is fundamentally predictable, right? So, and I think, bands like Cradle of Filth and Amon Amarth as well, they are not wildly inventive, very unpredictable bands, I don't think. They're not doing what jazz fusion is doing. That's not quite what I mean when I say that they're complex. And I'm sure if you had more of a background in music theory than I do, it would be much more predictable and much more obvious what they're doing and where they're drawing from. So it's not like super advanced. That's not quite what I'm saying, but it's just got a depth to it, a layering, right?
Right.
They've got this very orchestral, quite traditional, obviously inspired by classical music and inspired by soundtracks, and also sometimes inspired by sort of Baroque music and things like that.
Right.
They've got that layer, and over the top of that, they've got a very aggressive guitar rhythm section, which is sort of driving things forward. And then on top of that, they've got these sometimes quite technical, sometimes not, but highly melodic guitar solos and things like that going on. At the same time as all that, you've got this very different style of vocals, which doesn't involve so much singing, and it has a lot more sort of shouting and screaming and guttural sounds,
right?
Which is not something that you really experience in any other genre or setting.
Right.
Really, it's quite an interesting. Obviously, the human voice is capable of making a lot of sounds, and for the most part, that kind of guttural, screamy sound, we don't direct and use. We tend to reserve it for screaming in fear or in anger. It doesn't tend to be something that is used willingly or, to a purpose, or to an artistic purpose.
Yeah, I think maybe just at a football match.
Right. But I think that's another sort of example of its original sort of, that fits in with the shouting, screaming.
Mm. But certainly from a musical point of view, you're right. There are very few applications for that side of the human voice.
Right. And I think there is scope. I mean, I think Dani Filth, the vocalist from Cradle of Filth, has quite an impressive range. I have no idea whether he can sing, because he doesn't.
Right.
He might be a rubbish singer. I don't know. But for what he does do, I think he has quite an impressive range. I think that's one of the reasons that Cradle of Filth stands out amongst black metal acts, because a lot of black metal do a lot of inventive and interesting things with the guitars, but the vocals are a very sort of flat, monotonous, difficult to elucidate. Like, you can't really tell what they're saying. Whereas I think, again, people who aren't into this, who listen to Cradle of Filth, will probably think I'm being ridiculous when I say this, but I think that Dani Filth both has range. He can go from a very low sort of guttural growl to a very high scream and everything in between. And he also, as far as this genre of music goes, I think he enunciates quite well. And you can sort of make out what he's saying, or sometimes you do need to read the lyrics to realize, but having read them, it's very clear. And so, I think that is interesting as well. That is something that is not widely explored in music. There are parts of, there are black metal acts and death metal acts who don't have any of this orchestral side and don't have this kind of film soundtracky element to them, who I also like. And I like them, in the same way as you might like a number of other metal things, mainly for the aggressiveness and for the, strength of the guitar playing and all that. So I'm not trying to say that, this kind of metal is defined by that orchestral sound, just that a lot of the things that I happen to listen to have it.
That's really interesting. I wanted to just step back to a point in the middle of the conversation there with the idea of, if you are a musical consumer and you don't play an instrument, or you don't play the specific instrument that you're listening to, that whether or not you can be impressed by a musician who's playing basically highly technical music in an attempt, almost, I guess, depends on the style, and you can't really make assumptions about the objectives of a musician when they're playing extremely technical. But I don't know. This is a really difficult point for me, because I've grown up in a musical family, and I've always been around music and had a musical education and all of this, and so I've kind of it's kind of like when you speak a language, you can't go backwards. You can't go back to a point where you can't understand that language anymore.
Right.
So I've always found it hard to understand music from a non-musician's point of view, essentially. Like, I remember that my father generously bought my wife and I tickets to go see Al Di Meola play in Osaka. And for those who don't know, Al Di Meola is one of these legendary virtuosic guitarists from the late 70s electric jazz fusion era, and played with many greats such as Chick Corea and et cetera, et cetera. But I love Al Di Meola. My wife is not a huge, deep appreciator of music. She likes specific songs, and she likes one or two specific artists for reasons very different than I would. And when we went along, it's interesting that I was obviously in complete awe of this man's technical ability. And my wife just thought it was the most entertaining, bizarre, weird musical circus that she'd ever seen. Because the guy just comes out on stage and he's like melting his picks as he goes between songs because he does so fast. And he's just like, he's not even looking at his hands. He's just looking out into the audience, smiling at everybody as he's twiddling away with these, all of this incredible guitar playing. And afterwards, I was going on to my wife about how incredible his playing was. And I asked my wife what she thought. And of course, she just says, I don't know. I have no idea what I just heard, but it was great.
Right. I mean, but I don't think that's really so much the musician versus the non-musician aspect. Your reference to language earlier was quite apt, I thought. Any new genre of music, in fact, any new genre of anything, requires some amount of training before you can appreciate it. And I think to really appreciate highly technical jazz fusion, you probably need to have at least listened to some jazz.
Right.
And, similarly, to appreciate certain kinds of literature, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I think you need to be kind of invested. The first time you read a book from, say, the Victorian era, for example, the first time you read a Dickens or something like that, I think it can be quite hard going. And you might not sort of get what all the fuss is about. And you need to read some more to get yourself kind of tuned in to that genre of thing.
Right.
Before you can appreciate the finer points of it, and before you can really understand what it is you're supposed to be appreciating. And that's quite similar, I think, to when you very first learn a language and you go to whatever country it is that speaks that language. At first, it sounds kind of just like a wall of noise, and you can't even tell where one word ends and the next word begins. You can't even begin to break down the sounds that are coming at you to be able to think about them and analyze them and work out what's what and who's saying, what. And then, eventually, just after listening to it a little bit, you start to get a feeling for the rhythm of the language and get a feeling for, well, here is the end of one word, and I may not understand this word. I may have to look it up in a dictionary, but I can at least identify the start and end of the word that I need to look up, right? And then as you sort of experience it more and more, you get a feeling for the sentence structure, and you can say, oh, well, here's this general pattern, which I've recognized, and there's just this little bit here, which is different from what I'm used to. I wonder why that is. Right. And then you start to explore and you learn new bits of grammar that way. And I think that a similar thing probably happens with music, where you would tend to start off with, more mainstream or simpler music, probably. And then as you listen to more, as you branch out from some starting point, you see what other people are doing differently from the first people that you heard.
Yeah.
And you sort of notice those differences and appreciate them.
Yeah, I think the technical side of music, like an understanding of the technical aspect of music, it's kind of a very dangerous one-way street. And I, in my 20s, I found myself definitely moving along that street and very blinkered, because once you start out with that education of moving along, making an understanding of the musicological, the from an analytical point of view of what's going on musically, it is. I say that it's dangerous because it does sometimes, if you're not careful, it can definitely bring about a sort of very unhealthy elitism.
Right.
And you do see that with I think. Jazz musicians are famously stereotyped for being very elitist about what they do. And that's what I mean by dangerous, because I found myself in the 90s, I found myself definitely heading in that direction. And I loved extremely exquisitely well-produced techno, and I loved, and I dismissed other kinds of music, for example, punk rock. There was nothing in punk rock for me.
Right.
Because it's like, well, that's just 3 chords banged out as hard as possible on a guitar, turned up to 11, with some guy banging drums out of tune and somebody screaming. I mean, what's great about that?
Right.
Oh, now they're smashing their guitars. Good one, guys. It's kind of, I didn't see, because again, that's kind of elitism talking there, because from a musicological,
you were there, yeah.
From that point of view, I guess the language of that style of music is definitely an acquired taste and definitely something that you need to understand. I met a guy in the 90s, actually, who's still one of my very best friends to this day, and he loves punk music.
Right.
And he sort of helped me understand, not necessarily with punk music, it was a few other different styles of music that he liked, helped me understand that there's so much more, especially from a non-musical, emotional point of view, just sort of accepting it entirely from an emotional point of view, without any of that baggage from the analytical side, from that one-way street.
Right.
He definitely taught me that there's this whole other aspect to appreciating music that I'd sort of forgotten along that street, learning about, music theory and music history and music analysis and music production and all of those technical aspects of it. So that's why I'm always really, really curious about what non-musical people see in certain styles of music that they really love, because I can feel for myself that there's definitely something for me to learn from that, because I've just earlier in my life I was dangerously heading in the wrong direction as far as what I actually appreciate in music. Now sometimes I still just because I'm gaining that understanding, still that hasn't changed my taste in music. I still love really, really excellently produced music, and if I can hear that the musicians are fantastic and the production is top notch, then I'm going to like it whatever the genre is, which is still why I have trouble with punk rock often. But I mean, I'm still learning about these different viewpoints on music, even if I'm not actually being affected by those viewpoints, at least learning about them, being aware of them, and going some way to understanding them is still a significant thing. That's the reason anyway why I'm very curious to understand what it is that you really love in this style of music. Yes, so metal, it's great. I like Pantera, I like Dream Theater. Let's see, what else I like. There's a great Swedish melodic death, I don't even know what style, subgenre of metal it is, but there's a great Swedish metal band called Darkane, which I really like. And there's another really good Scandinavian, what would you call that, progressive metal, I guess. They're called Armageddon. And they have a singer who sings extremely virtuosically, like actual singing, which is the wrong thing to say in a conversation about metal, I'm sure. But also, there's some good. There's another like a symphonic metal band called Delane, I think, which is really good. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot to appreciate in metal.
Yeah, there's actually another sort of subgenre I've been trying to kind of get into recently and kind of exploring, is a thing called Oriental black metal or Oriental death metal or something like that.
Okay.
Oriental metal, which is not Far East as you might think.
Oh, okay.
It's actually from the Middle East.
Oh, interesting.
And so it's metal bands from Saudi Arabia and Iran and sort of Arabic countries, and they've got this very kind of Arabic sound to them.
Fantastic. That'd be really interesting. I bet they must have some funky scales.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. So that's kind of why I was interested. I just randomly, I can't even remember why the thought occurred to me, but I thought, I bet there's such a thing as Arabic metal, and I bet it's great. And this was when I was listening to a lot of sort of folk metal from Scandinavia, which has a lot of influence from, folk music from the respective countries of the bands. Although folk metal, actually, the very first folk metal band is a band called Skyclad, which is an English band. So it's actually an English invention, if you believe Wikipedia. But yeah, so I looked them up, and there are a few, and there are some interesting ones. I can't remember any of the names off the top of my head. Most of the bands that I found were either too... sounds like it's not really my place to say, but too Western, like not really what I was looking for.
Right.
they were just a band from that country who were trying to do the same kind of metal that we do in England or that they have in America. Like, you know, it was not, which is fine, that's their prerogative, but that's not the thing I was going out of my way to look for, right? I was hoping to hear something new.
Right.
And there were some other bands that kind of mashed them together a little bit ineffectively. Like they would go from this super Arabic, non-metal sounding thing to this very standard set of metal chords that didn't feel like they were moving in an interesting direction, but they hadn't quite found it yet. There were a couple of bands that I thought did effectively mix metal and rock styles and this sort of traditional Arabic scales and music that were interesting. For my taste, they were a little bit too almost new metal sounding.
What is new metal?
Nu metal was a genre that was really popular around the year 2000. It was bands like Limp Bizkit and
Korn
and Korn, yeah, that sort of band.
Right.
And they're, you know, okay, but they're just kind of, I don't know, something about them that annoys me. And yeah, there's one band that I thought was the best produced and the closest to the thing that I was imagining when I first had this idea.
Right.
Of the bands that I found. And they were good. And I think if you're into that kind of mainstream rocky metal, like it's on the border of rock and metal, right? It's not super aggressive metal or anything. It's fairly mainstream metal. If you like that sort of thing and then just want that with a little bit of a kind of Arabic flavor to it, it's good and interesting, I think. But I wouldn't listen to them a lot. And they make for an interesting change there.
Great. Well, that sounds, be curious to hear that.
Yeah. So we said last week that we were going to talk about language, and I've been studying ancient Greek recently, and before that, obviously, studied Japanese when I moved to Japan. And that is a sort of, I suppose, a continual process. You speak fluent Japanese and also Chinese, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. My major in university was actually Chinese and Japanese together.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, my mother being Chinese, my mother always thought that she didn't want to press her culture on her children if they weren't interested in it. And that actually had the reverse psychological effect on my brother and myself when we became extremely interested in it. And that's why I chose those two languages for my major in university.
Oh, okay, fair enough. So I think, the impression that I've always got from you is that you're quite naturally adept at languages, and it comes, it's obviously always hard work to learn a language, but the process comes quite naturally to you. Whereas for me, I always felt like I was one of these people that was not good at languages, and I really had to kind of push myself out of my element in order to be able to learn Japanese, which eventually I think I did. But I had to sort of very consciously adopt kind of techniques in order to achieve that. So I think it might be interesting because I think we'll come in from slightly different angles. But for you, is there a particular process you followed, or did you just sort of study what they said at uni? I mean, did you speak any of either of these languages before you started university?
No, I didn't. So yeah, I don't. Of course, I don't want to sound arrogant or anything, but I guess I can't deny that languages has always come a little bit easier for me than other things that I've tried to learn how to do.
I think there may be a sort of link between, obviously, your music. You've got a very musical background, and that is now your profession.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people say that there probably is a link between music and language. My grandfather also was, very talented musically and spoke a lot of languages. So I think there's something in that.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I mean, if one of them comes, then the other one generally seems to come fairly easily. So, for example, my son, he was totally bilingual by the age of 3,
right, in
Japanese and English. Of course, from the age of 0 to 3, it's not as if he's musically active. I mean, we have, obviously, he hears a lot of music and is exposed to a lot of music, but it's with the languages, just being exposed to both languages from the age of 0.
Right.
That meant that when he does music now, you can definitely see that he's somewhat gifted. So yeah, I think that's a fairly commonly assumed and quite correct hypothesis, that there's a connection between language and music. But
right.
Yeah, for me, I think when I was in Japan, I never really sat down with a textbook and studied that much. I did when I was trying to go for the Japanese language proficiency test. But because in that case, obviously, a lot of the stuff that they test you on is way, way outside of the standard sphere of what Japanese people would use every day in their business or in everyday conversation. So if you want to pass those higher graded Japanese language proficiency tests, really the only way is actually to go at it from a hardcore academic point of view.
Right.
But I guess for myself, the biggest thing that I did to help me was join a band. Because in a band, you are focused on something entirely different other than language learning. And it really is a sink or swim situation.
Right. You just are forced to use the language.
Yeah, and you're just exposed to it. But the other great thing about in a band is that you get exposed to many interesting, stimulating, and challenging applications of language. For example, arguments.
Right.
And, and observing arguments and taking part in them, breaking them up.
Right.
And I think one of you definitely know you've made it with a language when you're able to argue. And it's not a very pleasant thing, of course.
Yeah,
but
the first time you have to have a heated argument in a foreign language, that is a very sort of trial by fire kind of process.
Yeah, definitely, because your mind is so consumed with controlling your emotions, trying to convey the frustration that you're feeling in a constructive way, that you basically have to set the rest of your language center on total autopilot.
Right.
Kind of like...
Do you find that I tend to find... I mean, I'm not that prone to anger at the best of times anyway.
It's all the death metal you listen to.
But I tend to find that by the time what I'm saying has been filtered through the fact that I'm having to say it in Japanese, I'm just not that angry anymore. Like, I can't get that angry in Japanese. And and so it does, I mean, I think it's quite good. I think anybody, if you, for example, are in a relationship, and even if you both speak the same language, like you're both English or whatever, if you both happen to speak a foreign language as well, try using that one for your arguments, because very quickly you'll decide, oh, no, actually, it's not worth it.
I can just see the situation now. It's like, no, that's not what I mean. You misunderstand me. Wait a moment. Station 13 said...
Right, yeah. Actually, let's stop. Let's do this in French.
That's right. Okay.
Don't do it in Italian. You'll only get yourself in trouble.
Yeah, it just gets worse in that
More
case,
angry.
Italian or Cantonese, basically. If you go down those routes, the argument will never stop. The best thing that you can do for learning a language, I've always thought, is find a situation where the focus is not language learning. And if that situation involves emotion, then that is a real fast track to fluency, I've always felt. Right. But it's also important to remember that language is definitely a muscle. It's a kind of a mental muscle. And if you work at it, if you exercise and you work out, you get stronger. However, if you exercise, for example, one thing that I found when I was progressing in Japanese when I first got there was that some conversations I could have extremely fluently, and those would usually be the ones that I'm always having. Right. So, yeah. So people would say, oh, you speak Japanese. Why is that? Yeah. And then that conversation where you explain why did you come to Japan and how long are you going to be here and all that. So it is exactly like a muscle. So just like your body is full of, hundreds of muscles, if you work out just your arm's going to get really strong, but, is that going to affect the strength in your legs? Of course not. So just like language as well, if you practice, for example, being in a band, seeing, hearing, experiencing, being part of conflict of opinion, you get very good at that. And it just happens to be, fortunately, that conflict of opinion, i.e. expressing opinion, listening to opinion, giving feedback on opinion, being constructive, criticizing people in a very positive way, all of that kind of stuff you have to do in a band. And that happens to be very, very useful for business and very, very useful for daily life in a foreign language. So if you can find a situation where the focus is not actually academic learning, so you've got something else to be focused on, that takes your mind off the language and you're sort of forced to go into autopilot and you're forced to, an example that I used to give when I used to teach language is that if you have a child and you want the child to hold a cup of water that's very full, instinctively the child will look down at the water to make sure that they're not spilling it, and their hands will start to shake, and they'll walk very awkwardly and inevitably they'll spill it. So in that kind of situation, the best thing to do is to say, no, don't look at your hand, look at where you're going and just walk there. And you usually find when they're focused on where they're going and they're not focused on their hand, they'll do it without spilling anything.
Maybe I should remember that advice, because I go and get a coffee from down the road and I just take my mug and fill it with coffee down the road every morning at work. And I'm always spilling that on the way back.
There you go. Another example of that is, people who can run downstairs 2 steps at a time.
Yeah.
That's really scary if you actually try to do it thinking about it. But if you're in a rush for a train and you're not thinking about it, but you're seeing those doors about to close on the platform below, you'd be surprised how adept you can be at actually bounding down the stairs 2 or 3 steps at a time. Whereas if you actually look down and look at what you're doing, but oh boy, I'm going to fall down. So it's kind of the same thing. I think if you can find a situation where the focus is not what you're doing, i.e. speaking a language, but where you're going, i.e. expressing this opinion or keeping calm while somebody's insulting you, or, in my case, those were the things that I was doing in bands. That was sort of a real fast track for me. So, yeah, I guess the best advice that I could give for somebody currently learning a language is find that situation if you can. If you can't, try and create it. And also remember that you may be able to get extremely good at talking about why you learnt this language, or just one particular topic that people seem to ask you many, many times. However, that's just your arm. And if you want total body strength, which is what you need to be fluent, you need to be exercising your entire body. And so finding that diversity of those situations is also really important.
Yeah, I think that pretty much matches with my experience. One thing is that people say about Japan in particular, I'm sure this is true to some extent or another in most countries, but maybe varies in extent depending on where you go, is that it's very difficult to get people to speak to you in Japanese in Japan, because they all look at you, and, well, especially if you're sort of white like me, they'll just talk to you in English. And so one of the things that I tried to do quite early on is develop techniques to prevent that from happening before it happened. So I actually did almost purposefully do what you're saying about exercising just the arm, where I had a few phrases that come up very often, and I had the kinds of stories that come up when you first meet someone that I could say extremely well, and I would try and work on my accent and try and make those things come across as naturally as possible. And the other thing I tried to do very early on is to train myself to use the Japanese crutch words. So when I'm trying to think of the next thing to say, rather than saying or how do you say it, or whatever in English, I would use those fillers that the Japanese people would use. So that even when I was struggling to say something, I didn't sort of give the game away almost and switch to English. And by doing that, and this is almost like a mind trick where you are playing with the other person's confidence in a way.
It's like a delusion.
Because the other thing that is common in Japan, other than people assuming that you can't speak Japanese, is that they're very self-conscious about their English as well. And so if you can persuade somebody that you've just met that your Japanese is as good as or better than their English, then the embarrassment of speaking English to you will take over the prejudice of assuming that you can't speak Japanese, which if you want to move the conversation into Japanese, works in your favor.
Right.
And so it almost sounds kind of cynical to put that into words. But I found that was a very useful thing to do very early on. And then from then on, that meant that the default for talking to people was Japanese. And then I would get the opportunity to practice all those other muscles later.
That's really interesting because I never ever experienced that. I know many people who have experienced that, but I never experienced that at all. Like I never experienced people trying to speak to me in English. In fact,
right.
I never had that problem. I don't know why. I think it could be something because for sure, Japan has changed a lot in the past 17 years. I first got there in 1999. And, definitely, without a doubt, the late 90s, then the 2000s, there was at least when I look back at it, quite a noticeable change in the everyday acceptance of general internationalism, And when I was first there, it was a bit more bizarre to be foreign. It was a bit more unusual. There was more of a novelty factor. It could have also been the area that I was living in, which was, kind of semi-suburban area in West Japan. And I never had that issue where I would be trying to speak Japanese poorly, and the person would, realize that it was going to be far easier if they spoke English, even though they spoke it badly and they were embarrassed to do it. It was always just all Japanese. And I start speaking Japanese, then it comes back to me in Japanese.
Right.
This is opposite to the problem that I'm sure I'm going to have in Sweden here, because in Sweden, it's exact opposite in that Swedish people love to speak English.
Right.
And they do it extremely well.
Yeah, better than most English people.
Yeah. And that means that that presents, actually the problem that you were describing, where it's quite difficult to find opportunities to challenge your ability in Swedish, just because Swedish people will love the opportunity to practice their English with you and to speak English with you.
Right.
Japanese people are often misunderstood in that regard, I think. They used to be, at least when I was first there, because people would think, they don't speak English because, it's like xenophobia. Or I remember actually in those early 2000s when I was there, that was kind of, amongst the slightly more more jaded expats that I used to know there that used to experience that the Japanese people wouldn't speak English for them. They would assume that, that's like xenophobia or whatever, which is...
That's so funny, because now that's the reason they give for them not speaking Japanese.
Yeah.
You get so many foreigners who live there who just complain that, people are so racist because they just look at them and assume they only speak English.
Right. One thing that's really, really important for people to remember, and if you're considering going to Japan for some tourism, I strongly encourage that because it's a fantastic country. But one thing to remember is that the reason that Japanese people are embarrassed about speaking English is because they think that speaking English poorly is offensive. Which is really ironic, because if you go there and try to speak Japanese poorly, they'll be extremely happy.
Right.
So you often need to convince them, or we'll just flip it around. Think of it from the point of view of a foreigner. If the foreigner walks you're a tourist and you walk into a shop and you're a little bit nervous because you don't speak any Japanese, and somebody's trying to speak to you English very poorly, are you going to be angry and offended by that? No, you're going to be ecstatic. You're going to be really happy.
Well, you say that, but I'm not sure this is helped by the number of sort of aggressive tourists that you do get that just assume everyone in the world can speak English.
Yeah, yes.
It's not they bloody ought to.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I was actually, when I first heard you speak Japanese, and I heard, I knew, of course, your background in the language, and of course how, from your point of view, compared to me, where I guess I put together my bits and bobs of fluency through real in the trenches kind of practical situations. I was aware that your Japanese was much more academic.
Well, really?
Yeah. Well, that's the impression that I got when we first started talking about your background in Japanese. I was incredibly impressed of how amazingly fluent you were.
Well, thank you. Although I wouldn't describe my background in Japanese as being very academic. I thought the opposite because you studied it at university and I didn't.
Yeah, but I mean, at university you learn about as much as, at least in my case, it was only really the basics of grammar and the basics of pronunciation and writing, which is all you really need to get a good foundation to actually start off in a practical situation.
Right.
So that was, from that point of view, was extremely useful. But again, I mean, you actually studied from textbooks, right? I mean, that's academic.
No, I didn't. No. Oh. I did do the kanji. So that's the sort of interesting difference between what I'm doing now with ancient Greek and what I did with the Japanese. So with Japanese, I kind of followed a method based on a thing called All Japanese All the Time, which is a website, link in the show notes, but it's literally alljapaneseallthetime.com.
Right.
And the basic gist of his method is first, before learning any Japanese at all, you learn the English meanings of the 2,000 most common kanji, right? So that's to try and give you the same advantage that a Chinese person has going to Japan, right? You have a vague notion of the meaning of each individual ideographic symbol,
right?
But you don't necessarily know how to pronounce them, and you don't necessarily know what the meaning is when you put two symbols together.
Right.
You know, when you put the symbol that you've learnt means hand next to the symbol that you've learnt means bag, that does not mean handbag.
Right.
So there's mistakes to be made there. But at least you have a sort of vague, rough idea, right? And so that side of it is very sort of study-based and quite academic. And I did all that before I moved to Japan. So I decided in December of 2008 that at some point in 2009 I was going to move to Japan. I spent 2009 then sort of looking for a job and trying to find a way over there, and eventually moved to Japan in September. And over those 9 months, because my plan was to move to Japan, I spent that time going through this textbook.
Oh, I see.
And almost coincidentally, I finished it in about August. So it happened that I got through that textbook. It's a textbook by a guy called Heisig called Remembering the Kanji, which gives you kind of a mnemonic method for remembering how to read and write kanji, but only, with a single English meaning, not the actual Japanese words. And I got through that just before I got to Japan. And so by the time I arrived in Japan, I had a pretty good knowledge of all the most common kanji characters, but I didn't really know any Japanese except for the basic, hello, how are you, thank you, and all that. So I would find that, early on I could read signs and, guess what they might be saying, but I couldn't speak to people. I couldn't have an actual conversation with people.
Did you find that being a programmer, my brother is also a programmer, and he always says, all programming languages, they're all the same. In that, obviously, they're all very different. But what he means is that the expression of these kinds of purposes through programming languages, there are certain core aspects of programming which, once you've got those and once you experience with those, learning different languages becomes very easy.
Right. Yeah.
Did you find that your experience and your profession and your expertise as a programmer in multiple programming languages, did you find that helped at all in your ability to parse, learn, understand, and remember, syntax and grammar and vocabulary and things like that?
I'm not really sure, because I've gone from being a programmer who thinks he's not very good at languages to a programmer who has, successfully learned to speak a foreign language to a reasonable degree. And so all the things that I thought, I used to make up reasons for why I was bad at languages, and now I can just as easily make up reasons for why I'm good at them, or at least good at this one. But I think there's some relationship, but the scale is just totally different. I mean, I think, one of the hardest things with a language is just the sheer amount of vocabulary that every language has. And there's no getting around that problem. I mean, that's only solved through repeated and extensive exposure.
Isn't a programming language the same?
No, not really, because a programming language has a very limited vocabulary usually.
Okay.
And you can learn the fundamental sort of operators and functions that a programming language exposes to you very quickly. And I think what your brother says, I slightly take issue with the the idea that all programming languages are the same. I think that's a bit too reductive, and there are a few broad categories into which, programming languages fit, and those categories are kind of different. But I kind of see the basic point he's making. Within a language, you will then have APIs, right? You'll have libraries that are available to you, and how you draw 3D graphics on a Windows computer uses a different set of functions to the ones that you use to draw 3D graphics on a PlayStation, for example. So in that sense, you're almost like learning slightly different dialects of a very similar language.
I see.
But those are also individually quite limited. And if you take, all the APIs for everything that exists, you would get a vast vocabulary that it would be very difficult to remember again. But the reality is that you don't really need to know very much of this at any one time.
Right.
When you're working on the 3D graphics portion of a game engine for the PlayStation, you just need to become very, very good at that one thing without knowing about all the rest necessarily.
Right, and that obviously is a fundamental difference with spoken language then, isn't it?
Right, which tends to be much more broad, and you need a wider range. And it is true that there are interesting syntactic differences that exist, like word order is quite different in Japanese and in English. And now with ancient Greek, it's interesting again because word order is almost undefined. There are some instances where it's important, but you have a great deal of flexibility about the order in which you put words in the sentence because the words themselves are inflected to such a high degree that the endings to those words are modified so that you can see whether it what place it has in the sentence, whether it's the subject or the direct object or the indirect object, the thing that is being I gave a gift to so and so. And so you can see that just from the ending, which means that they're then free to put these words in any order they choose. And so that sort of difference is interesting. And I think you see similar differences between, for example, Lisp, which puts the name of the function or operator first and then all the arguments afterwards, compared to a more traditional language which uses like an infix mathematical notation where you say 4 + 5 rather than plus 4, 5.
I see.
So you get used to those differences, but I don't think being aware of how they exist in different programming languages really helps to that useful a degree in spoken word languages, except insofar as appreciating the possibility that these differences might exist.
Yeah.
Which I think can take a long time to get your head around if you've never encountered them before.
It's funny that there is such another fundamental difference, and perhaps this is kind of true with programming too, is the interesting way that there is such a phenomenon as the polyglot. The person who has this mysterious ability to just soak these languages up and, I think everybody knows at least one person who is like that has just this incredible magical ability to take on languages just extremely quickly. That same friend that I mentioned earlier who introduced me to the more emotional, less technical aspects of different kinds of music, he's a bona fide polyglot in that it's like 7 or 8 languages that he can just throw around casually. And, I don't really know whether that is some kind of wiring of the brain which makes learning languages that much easier, or whether you want to call it natural born talent, or if who knows what it is. But with that, there's definitely that kind of person. I guess programming is similar to, you'll get some incredibly creative genius programmers, such as yourself, Dani, who are able to sort of see programming languages in a slightly different way from the average programmer, and then utilize them in creative and interesting ways and problem solve with them far more efficiently than others. But
maybe. I don't know. I tend to fall down on the idea, and I have no scientific basis for this. It's just a complete sort of thing that I would like to be true almost. The idea that people have a tendency to be interested in certain things. And that's what comes naturally. And then the people that are drawn to those interests will naturally spend more time doing those things and then become very good at them as a result just of the time they've put into them. And that's what it is to be, in inverted quotes, naturally talented. So most of the people that I know who are very good at art, at drawing, for example, which is a skill that I absolutely lack, they tend just to enjoy drawing, just to enjoy doodling. They do it without even thinking, right? They might be on the phone to someone and just absentmindedly be doodling something with their right hand.
Right.
They probably wasted time at school doodling while the teacher was talking. They probably spent a lot of time as children just idly making shapes. And all of that has led up to them being the very talented artists that I know now. But and maybe there is some sort of genetic latent talent that exists in people as well. But I think it tends to be an interest-based thing that, just because the thing they happened to be drawn to when they were very young and continually over time was just they naturally did this thing that turns out to be very useful practice, that if you do it for hours and hours and hours over your lifetime, you just become very good at it. And similarly, I was always drawn to computers and programming, and so that is just a part of that form part of the way that I think. I think it affects the way that I think about things that aren't programming as well. I tend to try and break things down in a fairly analytical way, which can sometimes, not be all that useful, right? Yeah. But that's just the way that my mind has been trained from years of doing programming.
Yeah, that's interesting. But I definitely think that there's a case for natural talent as well, because I can see that in my children.
Right.
My children have been raised linguistically in exactly the same environment, in that mother speaks Japanese, father speaks English. Mother only speaks Japanese, father only speaks English. And both children were raised in exactly the same environment, and yet for some reason, my son was totally bilingual by the age of 3, whereas my daughter, who is now 3, only speaks Japanese.
Right.
And we haven't changed anything about the way that we've raised her, and nothing has changed about the environment that she's living in. They both grew up in Japan, at least until the age of 3. And yet, for some reason, she has failed to pick it up the way that he did.
Right.
And of course, when you're the age of 3, your interest is, I guess, maybe. I mean, you could. They always say that a child's attention span is the years of their age as minutes. So basically, a 3-year-old has 3 minutes attention span. So yeah, maybe she's just. Perhaps it is that she's just not really interested in really listening to figuring out what people are saying in different languages and then trying to imitate that with her own voice.
Right.
And maybe my son was, and that's why he got more practice at it. Maybe.
Where do you draw the line between interest and talent when you're talking about that sort of granular level?
Yeah, because interest is such a difficult thing to gauge with children because, and it definitely doesn't manifest itself in the same way that it does in adults. And a child's enthusiasm for something is affected by so many other things other than just interest. Yeah, this is an interesting topic. That whole discussion of, is there such a thing as natural born talent? Does that even exist? I used to be somewhat a believer that it didn't.
Right.
However, after having children myself and observing both children and the way that, there are just these things that for some reason my daughter can do so much better than my son can when he was at the same age. And the reverse is also true. And in that case, it was language that he picked it up so quickly, and we did exactly the same thing with her. And she's still, I wouldn't say struggling, because it's not struggling at all, because we don't put pressure on our children to try and learn languages or to force them to speak anything if they don't want to. We don't care, as long as they're communicating. But the environment and the approach was the same, and yet the result was totally different. And also, it's interesting that, like, at the same age, she'll be doing things like, she has these colored blocks, and at the age of like 1.5 or 2, she's sorting them into colors.
Right.
So all the reds are there, all the yellows are there, all the blues are there. Like, my son never did anything like that. I mean, when we saw that, it's like, oh, that's amazing. So now my wife and I have this really silly hypothesis that our son is much more oral and our daughter is much more visual. Who knows? I mean, parents we all have a great time sort of trying to see these things in the patterns that our children are growing up in, and making these little hypotheses, and of course, who knows? It's not really important whether or not they're true.
Reading the tea leaves, but
yeah, it's just really part of the fun of raising a child, but it's not really relevant and probably not correct in any way. But it's definitely changed my outlook on the validity of that argument, that there is such a thing as natural born talent. That you are gifted and you are born with this ability. Well, no, not ability, but you are born with this tendency to be able to do something very easily compared to other people, I guess is a better way to put it.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, it is sort of interesting. I mean, I think it is... I don't know if there is a sort of answer that everyone's agreed on. I am very aware that my tendency not to believe in the idea of sort of talent and to say that it's more to do with dedicated practice and the fact that your interests have led you to practice something without realizing that's what you're doing. I am quite aware that that is born out of the fact that I would just prefer that to be the case. It just feels unfair that some people are just born better at something.
Yeah.
And, life isn't always fair, so it may be so. But
yeah. Well, it's important to remember when it comes to what did I just call it? Not natural born talent, but the tendency to be able to do something more easily than other people. That doesn't mean to say that other people can't do it.
Right, exactly. It just takes a bit more effort.
Exactly. Perhaps. They just have to practice, So you could say that, yes, anybody can run as fast as Usain Bolt. Anybody can.
Well, yes. Although, I think there's a difference in exceptionally, world class, the best person in the world at something.
Right.
I think there is something fundamentally different about those people to the rest of us, because it takes something to push yourself to be, and they're often just so far ahead of any other living human.
Right.
That it just, there's no comparison.
Isn't that sort of a little bit of proof that the idea of a natural born tendency to be able to do something easier than everybody else
possibly
exists? When you think of like Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein or these brilliant people in the history of humankind, could you say that anybody with the right amount of enthusiasm and the right amount of dedication, practice and learning could develop the mind of Stephen Hawking?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, I think some of these people, I don't know about Stephen Hawking, some of these very successful people devote so much to what they end up becoming successful at that it's almost looks unhealthy, right?
Right.
It almost is the amount of hours, the amount of time, and the amount of things they sacrifice in order to become the best in the world or whatever it might be. I think is not the way that the majority of people want to live. And so it may very well be that, yes, you could become as good as them if you sacrificed everything they did and you devoted as much as they did to it. But that's not, is that a question of talent that they were born with? Or is that a question of that they've almost got something wrong with them, that there's something that can't be fulfilled without devoting this huge portion of their life to whatever this thing may be. And that they, miss out on something else. And the full rounded lives that the rest of us live may not involve, the same sort of exceptional one thing that you're exceptional at.
Yeah.
But on average, we can get a much broader range of experiences. Anyway, who knows?